Hola, hola. Bueno, buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Gonzalo.
Good morning. My name is Marcelo Mancebo, and together with Gonzalo, we form part of the quality consulting team. Our idea is to work on what we call a testing lab. I know that this may sound a bit strange to some of you, the idea of having um, of talking about good practices and particularly for testing. I'm sure that most developers know about it. Now, what's the idea then, and why do we think this is interesting? Well, we think that quality is something that must be present in all our development cycle. The development per se is not an exception. And that's why I would like to share with you what we work on in testing and things that we believe could be useful for you. Now, to start with, and to get to know one another, I would like to know whether you do any testing as part of your daily activities. You have to say this with your hand in your heart, because what we're going to do then is define what testing is. Testing is the assessment of a product through the exploration and research trying to obtain information. So that's going to be the testing definition that we're going to have. Now, as a developer, then, the question is, how can I have an impact on this definition? Well, we believe that there are two sort of possible approaches with which the developer may generate value and be a part of testing operations or activities, that is, providing support to the testing process or doing testing itself, testing operations themselves. Now, how are you going to do this? Well, if we talk about providing support to the testing process, one of the activities would be to provide information about the implementation of the project. That is, why have you decided to develop the system, the module in that way, and what have you thought about it? What was the reality like when the developer started working on that product? If that information is provided to the testing team, that's going to be very useful to be able to define things such as the strategy, define what kind of tests you're going to make, um, decide how much focus you're going to have on this. Another issue may be reporting known bugs. So, if I know that there is an error in the functionality or that there may be any complication or that there may be a scenario that poses risk, it would be good if you convey that to the testing team so that they can be considered among the possible risks and stress any possible errors that are known. So, for instance, if an error is known, well, this is a way to manage that error. And in that way, you start with a cycle of the incident to correct it, go back, and so on. Now, another important topic is that after you have corrected the bugs, you should provide feedback. Now, what happens is many times is that we work with tools for incident management. You've got a typical incident, you go up to development, it's corrected, and then from there it goes to testing. Now, when we see the classical case of this cycle, what happens is that the incident goes with what happened, with the description of what happened along. Everything that can help a developer localize and focus on on the error. But many times, that information doesn't come back in the same way. There may be comments such as what's been happening, when the debug was made or the activity made. That is, what was in fact the error that occurred, and what was the way of solving it. So this is very important information for testers, for the testing team, because it will provide information about whether there is going to be any impact on any other functionality that should be considered, either to make a retesting or for a regression stage. So after fixing bugs, it's interesting to provide information about it. And then the reuse of codes. Well, the idea is to reduce the effort of the testing activities. If we know how functionality works out and what the main problems are and the difficulties that you come across when working on that particular module or functionality, then you have already covered part of the road. You know where you have to focus on, and what are the good tests to be made. And then something that is very important, and that is to develop things thinking from the testing standpoint. We are going to discuss this at length later on, but testing is something that allows me to carry out my testing activities in an easier way. And Guillermo will be talking about this at length. Now, when we talk, that's how I can provide support to the testing process. But when we talk about making tests, what can I do as part of the development team? Well, in the first place, I can work in my unit testing. That is, the idea here, and let me open brackets here, we are thinking about ideas regarding good practices and that this can help your realities. Doesn't mean that everywhere you're going to be able to apply this all along, but in general, they are good ideas. So what we do is to work on unit testings, and that's good, or to have a testing strategy or a strategy based on tests, or to work on continuous integration. That's also an interesting thing to do. Now let us talk now about unit tests. What's the purpose of testing units? Well, this allows us to make tests on parts of specific codes, units that will be defined, and that those units are in fact the smallest parts that can be tested in an application. And we're going to be interested in isolating that part, that unit of the code, to check if its functioning is working correctly, specifically. Now, what are the features of all this? Well, I'll be interested in defining specific cases. Each case will be independent of the other cases because it will try to test something specifically, and just that. Well, in fact, we are doing all this so that the code behaves as we expect it to behave. For example, this procedure of GeneXus that carries out what it is supposed to do. Now, very simple problems that come up when I'm testing units. Well, our functionalities, the functionalities we want to test, require other programs, other elements to be run correctly. So the developer must model a reality that allows it, in many cases, to emulate the behavior of elements outside the unit. You must recall that what I want to test is to test that unit, and I don't want any other element interfere in my tests. So, for instance, we could have a group or a specific scenario of data in our database, or we could have now depends on when we are consuming third parties web servers, among other possibilities. So as you can see, all these are elements that could go against my test, my unit test. Very well. So what's the solution that we can have to these problems? Well, we have to try that the test in our unit is done independent. It's done independently because that's the purpose. We don't want to have any external interference. So what we can do is we can make some mocks or fakes or stubs that allow us to obtain those dependencies or simulate them in some way in order to be fully independent in my defined unit. We are going to be talking later on about how to generate this in some specific scenarios. Now, to wrap up uh, the this type of testing, we would like to show you some ways and some activities regarding testing units so that you can check the difference. I mean, how one refers to the activities of a developer and how the others have to do with the activities of a tester. Now, in unit testing, we would like to check units that are very small, small portions that are isolated of a code. In an integration test, we would like to see different parts of the code working well as a whole together. In the unit tests, we have a very small scope. Will have to focus on something very specific, whereas in integration tests, well, they will focus on the whole business. Something important about testing units is that they're going to be very simple. They're going to be very small, very simple to write and very simple to run. The idea is that we're going to have many unit many units that are tested, covering many parts of the code that we've isolated, and we'll be able to run them immediately. However, when we make integration tests, well, there we'll need different logic as a basis to run our tests, much more information, for instance, to make these checkups. In our testing units, we don't want to depend on any external component. And in our integration tests, dependence is a requirement because in an integration test, I want to see how everything is working as a whole. For instance, how you integrate two functionalities. When testing units, we'll have to do a mock test to be able to try it out. And in our integration tests, we'll want our applications to work in the most real and complete manner, that is, emulating reality, using the services to be used, and that in fact is the purpose. That is how to see how all those functionalities work. This is just to give you a general overview of the differences on when we talk about testing units and integration testing. So these are going to be sort of the basis of what when I think about my unit testing. There is another activity that I can carry out when I make tests, and that is the test-driven development.